Okay, it looks like we're starting to get critical mass here, so this is terrific. Already up to 120 people participating so far this morning, so that's awesome, and there are more coming every second here, but we can go ahead and get going. So welcome everybody to this interactive dialogue on the topic of ransomware, cyber hacking, and building cyber resilience in today's world. We're delighted to have you here with us today, and also two excellent panelists on this important topic. A couple of just housekeeping matters for folks that have participated before and those who haven't yet participated. First is that all the materials and the sign-in information were included in the reminder email that was sent to you yesterday, the 21st of June. And so if you'd like to get a copy of the PowerPoint materials, those already have been provided to you and they should be in your email right now. Second is that this is a very interactive presentation format. We pick a topic, we find two or a certain number of genuine experts on the topic, and then we discuss that topic with people like yourselves who are interested in the topic. And I'll be asking questions of our panelists today, but if you have specific questions or the then please go ahead and note them in the chat pane. If you have any desire to keep your name confidential, then just put that note in the chat as well, and I'll make sure and keep it confidential. I try to do that anyway, but we'll make sure and get to all the questions as long as time permits in the chat pane. So if you have any follow-up questions afterwards, though, don't hesitate to reach out to the individuals who are the presenters today, and they'll be happy to answer questions directly. So briefly, my name is Mike Droke. I'm a partner at Dorsey and Whitney law firm. I'm one of the co-practice leads for our international food, beverage, and agribusiness practice group. We have over 200 lawyers who participate in our food, beverage, and agribusiness industry group. So it's one of the largest within Dorsey and has amazing breadth and strength within the industry, which I'm delighted to represent and lead. This topic is personal to me because my son Will just completed a program on cybersecurity and is moving his career into that field. And there's nothing quite like the parental joy of having a text from your child saying, "Hey, Dad, I just hacked into a system. Isn't it great?" Like, oh, okay, well, it's for good, right? He said, "Oh, yeah, for sure." So in any event, very excited to have today's program. Rachel, could you give a brief summary of your background?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Rachel Lavender. I'm at Marsh and McLennan Companies. I'm a leader within our cyber practice here in North America. I sit in Washington, D.C. I've been at Marsh for 18 years, predominantly in the management and professional liability arena. And before that, I like to say I'm a recovering accountant. So I worked in all manner of accounting roles within companies, but predominantly I like to say I was the translator between the accounting and finance folks and the IT folks whenever we needed to get a system to work properly. So long time sort of in the cyber and technology space, and looking forward to talking to everyone today.
And for those unfamiliar, can you describe what Marsh is in your practice in cyber?
Yes, Marsh is the insurance brokerage arm for the Marsh McLennan Company. We have a reinsurance arm, we have a health and benefits arm, and we have a consulting arm. We focus primarily with corporations who we place all manner of insurance coverages for them. So we are their broker. We're not an agent for the insurance company. We are the broker. Our relationship is with the companies in question that need the insurance. And we work with those companies both in the pre, during, and post-loss sort of claims advocacy piece too. My practice is focused specifically on cyber risk and technology errors and omissions, or larger professional liability arena. So my team here in the Southeast focuses primarily on placing cyber and professional liability insurance coverage for all sizes of companies, small, medium, and large, both North American, landlocked, as well as globally around the world.
Awesome. Deb, can you summarize her background?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So I'm Deb Howitt. I'm a partner with Dorsey and Whitney in the Denver, Colorado office. I've been practicing law in the areas of technology, transactions, privacy, and cybersecurity for over 20 years at this point. Privacy law wasn't really much of a practice area when I started, but now it takes up almost all of my time. It's really grown significantly. And I've had positions during my legal career, both in-house as well as at law firms. So I certainly understand the in-house perspective and how to sort of keep things practical and realistic because I've been there and I recognize some of the challenges there. And I help companies currently with compliance with privacy and cybersecurity laws, as well as responding in the event that they have a data breach, unfortunately, which happens, and also handle digital marketing and various other compliance aspects. Thanks.
Well, you're taking straight into the next slide, really, about the current threat landscape, not if you get hacked, but when. And Deb, can you talk about kind of what you've seen? You mentioned that in the course of your career, the idea of cybersecurity didn't even really kind of exist to some degree. I myself wrote my law review article on a technology that was so new that there was literally no description of it. I had to analogize to prisoner rights and such, and that technology is called email. So in any event, can you give us a summary?
Sure. Yeah, so as noted on this slide, unfortunately, the current landscape is really not if a company gets hacked, but when. Maybe they have already been hacked or subject to some other type of cyber incident. And Rachel will be providing with us with some statistics, but it's really rare these days to find a company that hasn't been the victim or at least an attempted victim of phishing or social engineering or other cyber attacks. So it's extremely widespread at this point.
We listed out here, in fact, there's an image of the FBI, which had sent out a few months ago, about a month and a half ago, a specific warning of risks in the agriculture sector. And this presentation is through our food, beverage, and agribusiness industry group. Why would that sector be specifically targeted for risk here?
So the FBI actually found that that sector was targeted last year and has been targeted pretty heavily. One reason is due to the timing. There's specific planting and harvest seasons that are very busy, and they know, the threat actors know that companies will be distracted during those times with the business, right? And so, companies may be more vulnerable during those times. With other sectors also, this happens during holiday periods when they know people are distracted and on vacation. So sometimes it's a matter of timing, but also, due to the centralization and consolidation of the industry as well, I think they can, reach out and target specific companies focused on the timing and, get the result that they want, get companies to pay the ransom. So, there's, significant disruption possible with supply chain in seeds and fertilizer and all kinds of activities that can impact these companies. So I think the threat actors know that and they reach out in this sector a lot.
I've been fascinated to watch the baby formula situation, in part because you have consolidation, which makes sense of why you would consolidate production in certain locations and within companies. But then the result of that was that a food recall really is what happened, that triggered a plant shutdown to clean, and then ultimately a shortage across the nation in this very important product. Do you see those kinds of situations as really raising the profile of the sector toward the threat actors?
Yes, I think so. And these threat actors are smart and they look for the opportunity and they follow the money. And they know that if things are consolidated with certain large suppliers, that's a great target for them to pursue. That's what happened with JBS, the largest beef supplier in the world, and they went after JBS. And yeah, it could happen with formula or with other areas where there's significant demand and significant consolidation in a specific area, unfortunately. So those companies certainly should be on greater alert, I think, just in case.
And you mentioned here that the smaller companies face a perfect storm. What do you mean by that?
So smaller companies, first of all, don't necessarily have the budget or the manpower or the time to really focus on this area. I mean, they're busy running their business and growing their business. And yet at the same time, they may have extremely valuable trade secrets in their possession that threat actors want to attack and exfiltrate and potentially try to sell on the dark net. And smaller companies often, generally always don't have the ability to negotiate the terms of the contracts with their service providers. They just don't have the leverage that larger companies do. So they're sort of forced into standard contractual terms that may not be as favorable to them. And yet at the same time, they're subject to these laws that require reasonable cybersecurity measures, that require certain terms to be in contracts to protect personal data. And it's been challenging for a lot of them who are just now sort of learning about it and realizing that this is something they need to focus on.
Rachel, I know you often are in the role that you play called in very, very early once a threat has an incursion has been made. How would you describe the current threat landscape?
Well, we're in a quiet period right now. I think there's a lot that's going on right now with the geopolitical situation where, from a ransomware perspective in particular, it's gone a little quiet, and I think that's mainly because Russia is preoccupied. Their hands are full in the Ukraine. However, there is a common belief and sort of perception that that quiet period is coming to a rapid end very soon. I think with the 4th of July holiday, Deb mentioned holidays, that tends to be the time when my team and I brace for impact. So we send emails out to our distribution colleagues and our clients to say, this is a time where you have shorter staff on call, fewer people are working and manning the monitoring tools that you have in place to keep an eye on your systems. People are a little lax in their own personal cyber awareness. They click on links sometimes, not really thinking. They have visions of 4th of July fireworks and barbecue and hamburgers and hot dogs. So I think what we're going to see is there will continue to be an escalation of words between various countries, the US included. And I think at some point we can expect the ransomware threat landscape to increase again. And so that's where we've been super focused, is just making sure. I think if there's anything a company can do, it's make sure all of your employees are sort of aware of their own personal responsibility in protecting the crown jewels.
I grew up in a beach town in California. I worked at an amusement park, but I never thought cybersecurity would also be a seasonal business. But that's what each of you are describing. Mm-hmm. But both because of the actual season of the businesses that are under attack, and also these kind of external factors. That's just fascinating. Mm-hmm. So, Rachel, still to you, you had put together a fascinating report earlier this year, working with Microsoft company to identify the types of cyber attacks that are experienced by organizations. And I thought this was particularly fascinating because it shows the total number of organizations that have experienced an actual attack, which is a shockingly high number, and then also the variety of mechanisms. So can you talk about the survey and why it was done, how it was done?
Yeah, sure. We started doing this report in partnership with Microsoft a number of years ago. We do it about every 2 years. So, it was initially, we send it out to thousands of companies. And this year we had about 650 to 700 respondents. And these are business leaders that focus on areas around cybersecurity. So we asked them a series of questions. And really the original intent of our report was to sort of understand, a foundational year over year, what are the perceptions that business leaders have around their capabilities around cybersecurity, as well as their perception of how much they are at risk. And the idea was over the course of a period of time, say 2, 4, 6 years, how have those perceptions changed? How have those views changed? And in this case, what we were really trying to get at is how many of you have really been attacked? Because you hear about this all the time, right? There are various sources out there, whether it's Verizon's data breach incident report, or you hear the FBI throw numbers out there. There's all sorts of third parties that report on the number of breaches, but what does that mean, right? And so that was the other thing, is we were trying to get a handle on what are the types of attacks that are happening, what percentage. And so that's where this nearly 75% of the respondents said they had suffered some form of a cyber attack in the last 12 months. And then this broke it down. I think one of the things that is always interesting to me is some of these types of attacks lead to one of the other attacks, right? So
how would
phishing
that
and
work?
social engineering, yeah. So for phishing and social engineering, right? So primer on that, what is that? That's, I get an email from someone purporting to be insert. It could be a vendor, it could be a trusted supplier, it could be an internal colleague that they're phishing, they're acting like they are, impersonating, if you will, and they're asking me to do a thing. Usually it's send me money, right? Like, hey, we've got this confidential project. We need you to wire transfer money to XYZ. And don't tell anybody about it, by the way, and don't follow the normal protocols we're supposed to follow to wire transfer money. The other form that happens is a subtlety, which is someone impersonates a vendor that I work with and says, hey, change our banking details. We just changed our bank. Here you go. Here's our new banking details. And then we pay a bunch of invoices, and we find out 6 months later when the vendor comes back and says, why haven't you paid your bills?
Yep.
But what happens is oftentimes if they're impersonating that email, impersonating that individual or party that we work with, there's an underlying breach that's happened somewhere. It could be on the vendor side, or it could be on my side of the coin. And so that could ultimately lead to a ransomware attack. It could lead to, because they've dropped code somewhere and they're just waiting, lying in wait. It could lead to a privacy breach. A ransomware attack could lead to a business interruption, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of what was interesting about these. And as we've worked with our clients, it's rare that one of these happens in isolation. Usually one of these types of disruptions that are noted here on this chart occur in pairs.
It's interesting. I was reminded as you described that, a friend of mine was a CFO at a company and happened to be in the office, and somebody walked by and said, oh yeah, I got it taken care of. And my friend said, what'd you get taken care of? He said, oh, I've all lined up for the wire transfer. He says, the what? And so sure enough, they fortunately stopped and were able to discern that somebody had faked a URL with the name of the company with just a letter inverted. So it looked, if you're reading real quick, it looks like it came from his email. And then as it dialed back, turned out somebody had hacked into a Gmail account, which had his work email address in it. And, so like you said, it was a progression, it took a lot of work, but ultimately there was a multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars of wire. All of which prevented because of the random coincidence that they were in the office and happened to walk by. And now, as so many folks are working remotely and we're all getting calls from our best friend Spam Risk every hour, we're in such a unique kind of situation. So you've mapped out some of the numbers as you described from the survey, trying to observe those trends. And there's a lot of data on this slide for the participants. You're going to see that in your email from yesterday. But can you unpack this a little bit for us, Rachel?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk to our clients about what is going on in the cybersecurity landscape and what they need to be thinking about, both from a preventive measure, but also how do we respond, we found that, you know, analyzing data from ransomware attacks since pre-pandemic has been really interesting. So there have been a lot of lessons learned. And I think one of the great things is that, you know, the average ransom demand paid and demanded actually is beginning to decrease. We've seen some early signs of that. Some of that is because clients have been able to secure the assistance of ransomware sort of cybersecurity forensic companies that specialize in this. So they're able to nip it in the bud sooner, but they understand the profile, right? You have these ransomware rings. Conti is one of the famous ones. They break up, then they get back together. They come with a different name. So there's a number of ransomware groups that have sort of an MO, if you will. We know how they're going to operate. We know how they're going to demand. And so the negotiators have gotten better at negotiating with them down because we know what their motivation is, right? They want to get in, they want to get out, and they want to move on to the next victim.
I had a client who described this very thing. They had a hack of their HR data, and he said that it was almost like a concierge experience, you know, that, oh, here's the price, and then when you know, we send you the key, then they have a whole suite of services available to you for the recovery, the proof, et cetera. And he said you almost wanted to thank them for their helpfulness after you were held up. It was crazy.
Yeah, they have customer support and everything.
Great, yeah, 800 number, the whole 9 yards.
It's awful.
And then we had Samuel asked an interesting question, I think, and also one that could be changing in the moment, which is, are you finding that the hackers are demanding cryptocurrency for payment to try and avoid law enforcement? And if that was the case, do you think it's still going to be the case after the last 2 weeks? It's really to either
cryptocurrency, from my perspective, it remains the most effective tool they're going to continue to use for payment. I do think the volatility in that market certainly has drawn some questions, but the anonymity of that form of payment is hard to argue with if you're a bad actor. But I don't know if Deb has any thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, they were using it many years ago before the escalation in value of Bitcoin, right? So I think they'll continue. They'll just be asking for a greater number of Bitcoin than they would have 6 months ago when it was higher value.
It weirdly it would encourage me, if I were a CFO, to buy a little Bitcoin just to have available, if it's at a low price right now. And then, Rachel, I was fascinated by a phrase that you used here called data exfiltration. What is that?
Yeah, so data exfiltration is nothing more. They're taking the data off your systems. Look, most of ransomware in and of itself is nothing more than a virus. It's malware that has been placed on the system by the bad actors in some way, shape, or form. They found a way to get in there, whether it's because you clicked on a link, or they were in the system already through a good old-fashioned breach, and they dropped the code. And so what's going on is sometimes this goes back to what's the motivation of the bad actor? Is the motivation financial driven, or do they have other surreptitious reasons for getting in there? If there's particular data that they want to hold hostage, right? Hence the ransomware. Sometimes there's also some very high value data that they can sell on the dark web. So there's a fair amount of data exfiltration going on. Also, what they're doing is they're taking snapshots of that data to say, sometimes they have to have almost like proof of life, as we've seen in kidnap and ransom. So this is them saying, look, if you don't give us this money for the ransom, we're going to show this to the world that we have it. So they're just showing you, we have the ability to get at this data. We already have it. If you don't pay us, we're going to disclose it. So that's a big part of it, of the exfiltration piece.
So as we move on to the legal topic, one final question, Rachel, for the last couple of slides. As people are rereading this very dense and important information, are there a couple of key threads to pull from if you're a risk manager, CFO, general counsel?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of the tools that are used by many companies and preferred by insurance companies that you use to prevent and mitigate loss. But I would say everybody on the line needs to get a good understanding of their incident response plan and the backups, because one of the things we've seen from a mitigation perspective, you may not be able to prevent the attack, but if your backups are secure, encrypted, and well tested using an incident response plan, that's going to be the quickest way and the most effective way at mitigating the total loss. So backup plans, that's where we go.
Terrific. You know, moving to the kind of legal landscape here, Deb, I was fascinated. The first couple of major cyber hacks that happened and the lawsuits that were filed externally, you know, by shareholders, et cetera, really started in the area of all things of employee benefit plans. And I remember at the time really scratching my head about that and calling some of our ERISA litigators to say, hey, why would that be? And it was fascinating. The answer that they had was that often to prove actual damages, if you're a customer whose information's been stolen, it's a little bit difficult to establish that. And for ERISA, there's both a fiduciary duty to maintain confidentiality and also an attorney fee hook, so that even if there's not actual damage, you can still go after and try and get the attorney's fee. So looking at it from a litigator perspective, that made sense. But now, I mean, since that time, the number of states internationally, of course, that have imposed privacy restrictions and damage opportunities on companies are not only significant and growing, literally seems like every day. So can you walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah, so there have been quite a few states really over the last decade that started implementing legislation related to data security. And only really in the last few years have all 50 states now passed laws related to data breach notification. And there are 50 different state laws related to data breach notification. So that keeps things fun. They are very similar, frankly. So those of us who do this on a regular basis know how to deal with all of them when you need to do notification. But things are changing. I mean, because there are these 50 different state laws and the states are sort of trying to keep up with each other. You know, every year, generally at the end of the year, a handful of states will update their laws to include new data types that require notification or to shorten the time period in which notification is required. And then there are changes also in different industry sectors, and the New York Department of Financial Services now, as of a few years ago, requires certain companies in the financial sector to notify within 72 hours to the regulators. Under GDPR, the European laws, there's notification of regulators in certain cases, depending on the risk level, within 72 hours. There's a new law passed in the US that's not yet effective, and they're still working out the regulations and the rulemaking and all of that. So to be determined exactly who is subject to it, but it's generally related to critical infrastructure, which will likely include some in the food and agriculture sector that will require notification in 72 hours to regulators as well. So, I mean, when you have a breach, if for the companies on the line who have been subject to one, sometimes it takes a while to really figure out what happened, and even if there was a breach, and just to get your head around, do we need to report? Does this meet the thresholds? What are we doing here? So having a strong and tested incident response plan is really mandatory. And I'll talk in a little bit about what that should contain.
We learned during COVID that food and agribusiness is part of the national security infrastructure plan for the United States. And it doesn't surprise you when you stop and think about that. But as you take that from COVID and you kind of place that over into this area with, as you mentioned earlier, some choke points in the supply chain that really can affect the national security ultimately. I mean, literally the Defense Production Act for baby formula, right? So I would imagine there's going to be much more significant regulation. And one of the things I've noted is that it does seem to take a while, that when the act gets announced, it's often months prior. And what's behind that?
So many, as I mentioned, there's all these different state laws, but many of them will allow a company to delay notification in the event that it might potentially interfere with the investigation. Very often law enforcement will mandate that if law enforcement is targeting an investigation to a specific group and they don't want to tip off the group that they're onto them and they're investigating them, they might require the company to delay the notification. Some of my clients, frankly, in some breaches have decided not to notify law enforcement because particularly in cases where they're dealing with employee data, like employee social security numbers, they want to get the information to the employees ASAP that, hey, your data has been breached and we want you to take steps to protect it and to protect yourself from identity theft, and we'll help you. And they sometimes won't even go to law enforcement until after they've notified, just because of that. And sometimes, frankly, it's because a company doesn't know they've been breached. So that happens as well. But I know in some very large incidents that we've all heard about in the media, some of the delays in notification were due to law enforcement.
And then I have two quick questions on the last bullet point. First is, what is a safe harbor? And second is, what are the laws that apply? Is it based on where the company is located, where the server is physically, where the target individuals are? How do you figure that out?
Yeah, so the laws are different. And there are various different laws. So numerous states have laws regarding protection of the personal information of residents of that state that will typically be applicable based on the location of the resident. So if you're a company in Denver doing business online and you have customers in all 50 states, many of these laws will apply to you because you have data on residents of those states. And so you need to protect that data in accordance with the laws of that state, and you need to notify those residents in accordance with the law of that state if you have a breach. There are others that have certain thresholds. I mean, the CCPA is one that became effective in California in 2020, and I'm sure everyone on the call probably has heard of that one. And that only applies to companies who have a certain revenue threshold, over 25 million in revenue a year, or a certain amount of personal data, or they're selling a certain amount of personal data and they're doing business in California. And other states have different thresholds, so it depends a little bit. And these safe harbors, currently there's only 3, but it's very likely that other states will follow because that's typically the trend in privacy and security laws within the US. So these states have recognized that there are a lot of lawsuits in this area, and they want to protect companies. These are generally companies that are headquartered in the states, or primarily doing business in the states. They vary though, so I don't remember off the top of my head exactly who is subject to each one of these. But the idea is, if a company is really trying their best, they have a cybersecurity plan in place, they have somebody in the company heading up the operations with regard to security, they have policies in place, they're following them, maybe they're aligning their program with a well-established cybersecurity framework, NIST, ISO, number of others, that they shouldn't be subject to all of these lawsuits just because a threat actor happened to get in because somebody clicked on a phishing email. It happens. Kind of even if you have your house locked, people break in. So so in some of the states there are affirmative defenses available to these lawsuits. And it just varies a little bit from one state to the next, but it's helpful.
Terrific. Rachel, I imagine that given the nature of your work with various companies, a lot of times you're an early point of contact. You call in the lawyers to get advice on notifications and get the attorney-client privilege activated, I hope. But can you kind of walk through what happens once a breach occurs?
Yeah, I mean, after the hair on fire and everyone's running around like chickens with their head cut off, at some point I get a phone call or a frantic email. My favorites are the ones where it's a cryptic email and no one's really telling me the details. They're just like, hey, so do you have a copy of our policy? And I'm like, why do you want to know? Your renewal was 6 months ago. But yeah, I mean, normally the first thing we do is we get on the phone and we talk through, all right, what happened? Like, what do you know as of this moment in time? And so the first thing we say to clients is call us very early, because the sooner we get involved, we can ask you some of those important questions to help guide you to who you may need to bring in from outside to help you navigate that. Most insurance companies have a pre-approved list of firms, outside counsel, such as Deb, who can help guide them around the privacy and the regulatory landscape. But there's also the things we talked about earlier, forensic investigation, ransom negotiators, and all manner of information security due diligence that you don't want your internal people doing. Because quite frankly, number one, if the people are in their system, it's very difficult for people who work day to day in that system to be objective. But also oftentimes they don't deal with this every day. So they don't know what to look for when it comes to the ransomware attackers. So it's best to hire a third party. So when you're building out your incident response plan, what we often tell our clients is the first place you should look is the pre-approved panel list from the insurance company with whom places your cyber insurance, because those are the firms that insurance company works with day in and day out, and they've been well tested. So we spend a lot of time sort of doing that because unfortunately, very few of our clients have that incident response plan ready to go, much to our chagrin, and they don't know they don't have preset retainers in place with outside counsel or with forensic firms. And candidly, I will say this, for full transparency, I don't know that having a forensic firm on call is always the best case, because every ransomware attack is different. Every company and how they build their IT architecture is different. And so how that ransomware attack evolves and develops can be different from company to company. That being said, at least having the list, and sorry, my dog is losing her mind now, but at least having that list available and having familiarized yourself with the companies that are on it could be a way to save time in the incident itself and responding to that incident in a more effective way.
So, Deb, if you could talk about incident response planning in hopes that folks listening obviously are highly interested in this topic and activated about it. Mm-hmm. Can you walk through how an incident response plan is built and what it should have in it?
Sure. I mean, it's basically the roadmap for what to do in the event of an incident or a breach. And as Rachel mentioned, when these happen, it's often chaos. Everyone's scrambling, and having a plan in place that says, okay, first do this, then notify this person is extremely helpful. Also, make sure it's printed out, because if your systems are locked down because of ransomware, you need to have a paper copy. So clients have to deal with that and call me up on the phone and say, hey, can you send us a copy of our plan? So it will describe who are the team members. It's not just an IT issue. The C-suite needs to be involved from all departments. People don't necessarily realize, like, okay, HR needs to be involved, PR needs to be involved, finance, depending on the nature of the incident, it could affect any number of systems. It could have been perpetrated by an internal actor. Yeah, you never know. And have contact information, have everybody's personal cell phone, personal email as well, again, in case systems are down, and how will you communicate? List the third-party professionals. And Rachel mentioned that, it may not be necessary to have a relationship established in advance, but I've found for many of my clients it's helpful, again, because it's just chaos and they don't want to be interviewing different providers at that time. They want to at least know, okay, this is the person we call. Sometimes some companies will have a retainer that allows you to know that they'll respond within 24 hours or whatever. They can be on site in a designated time period. I've worked with some of my clients and their forensics providers to establish in advance an engagement letter format so that I can engage them on behalf of my client, and then the forensics provider will prepare the report for me as outside counsel in an effort to protect that as privileged. Doesn't necessarily, mean 100% it will remain privileged in, all jurisdictions, but it's worth trying for sure. And then the plan will walk through. Sometimes it's set up with different playbooks. Like if it's a ransomware attack, this is what you do. If it's phishing, this is what you do. If it's a lost laptop, this is what you do. And it's just extremely helpful.
I love the irony of somebody keeping their response plan only in electronic form.
Yeah.
And then you have a ransomware attack. It's like, oh my gosh. Another thing I've had a couple of clients actually do and talk to me about is have a no computer mechanism to operate, with personal cell phones. How do you manage equipment? How do you run your basic systems, and having something like that. So having some incident response plan, probably something is better than nothing, and the more detail, the better, I would assume. Don't let perfection become the enemy of accomplishment. And use that old-fashioned thing made out of wood called paper, and print a copy somewhere, or a couple of them around, so you can access them. And then as part of that, I'm assuming that you'd implement some basic control mechanisms. And Rachel, can you kind of walk folks through what's recommended as far as cybersecurity control?
Yeah, sure, Mike. I think, as we've navigated this really interesting insurance landscape since the pandemic started, we all uncovered when we started working from home, all of a sudden, open portals and bad actors getting into systems with there wasn't even a speed bump slowing them down. They just walked straight through the door, or as I call it, the open window in the back of the house. And so underwriters have really been getting very laser focused on what are the controls that, if in place, can prevent the attack from happening, or if the attack happens, what are the controls in place that could slow them down or ultimately mitigate. These first 5 here, starting with multi-factor authentication all the way through email filtering and web security, are hands down the top 5 that every insurance company is going to say, and quite frankly, every cybersecurity professional is going to say are the most important. There's no question. They may have a different impact on how the insurance policy is underwritten, but every insurer, these are like bare minimums. The others, beginning from patch management all the way down to vendor and digital supply chain risk management, they all are also important, but they really do have a significant amount of variability in terms of how the underwriters look at them. Some of these, patch management has become much more important, especially when you look at SolarWinds and Log4j. Those are both attacks that are directly tied to patch management. I mean, those are because patches were not implemented. And actually, quite frankly, going all the way back to WannaCry and NotPetya, that was all about patch management. There were known patches available. SolarWinds and Log4j, you could argue those were identified as these need to be patched, And so the entire world jumped all over it and said, okay, we got to patch it. WannaCry and NotPetya, though, that was all about known patches that had not been implemented in huge geographic areas of businesses. And that's how the bad actors got in. So patch management has become more, it's less about, okay, I know I need to patch it. It's how do you identify critical patches and how quickly can you get them made,
implemented,
and implemented.
It's totally a layup, like you missed the layup shot, So, and thank you, Scott, for reminding me. Vendor management and supply chain aspects. Deb, can you kind of talk a little bit about how to handle the cyber risk when it's not your company, right? I mean, this is the essential question, and how does that work?
Yeah. So this slide and the next slide go into a little more detail, but just at a high level, you want to take some measures at least to evaluate the security of your vendors. You can send them a security questionnaire. There's various forms available online. We have one that we use for our clients to get them to complete it, and it'll tell you a lot about the company. I mean, you might want to ask for some of their specific security policies. They may disclose it, they may not. Many large vendors will have already a document that will describe their security measures and whether they have certification under a specific framework or whatever it may be. Will definitely tell you a lot. And then as you're negotiating contracts, you can require that the vendor notify you within 24 hours if they even suspect a security incident involving your data, or immediately if you have the leverage to get that in your contract, right? You can require that the vendor indemnify you if there's any data breaches, or and definitely look at your limitation of liability provisions and have carve outs if there's a data breach or privacy violation, that type of thing. And then work with your IT team on implementing vendors, make sure there's processes in place. We work on like vendor management program for our clients, make sure everyone knows when a vendor contract is terminated, that you actually terminate their access to your systems, that kind of thing. There's a lot of steps you can take.
These hygiene aspects, don't click on every link. When your vendor contract terminates, terminate all access rights,
right,
et cetera. And the others that you mentioned, Rachel, it's always kind of stunning to me how easy it is to forget the fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
Rachel, do you have any top recommendations in regards to vendor management?
No, I mean, I think Deb's hit most of it. The due diligence process for onboarding vendors, and when companies conduct formal RFPs or vendor selection, I think is super important. Having those minimum security standards is one that is overlooked oftentimes in the rush to get at the capabilities that vendor has to bring. So it's that part is hard and difficult, and vendors aren't always willing to open up the door, open up the hood, so to speak, so you can look at their security. But find a way, an objective way of evaluating that, whether it's a report from a third party or due diligence, so on and so forth, or a questionnaire.
A couple of things struck me in the concept of vendor management. One is that I work with a lot of vendors because we're packaged good companies or retailers and the like. And there's definitely what I would call survey exhaustion. So many things they have to comply with, so many checklists they have to fill out, and the extent that you can make it as easy as possible. Second is that the issue of information security is way far down the list of the things that folks are worried about, which means that they'll get to it, but when they do, it's going to be like, oh, wait, we need this yesterday, and you've got to stop everything and get all this information. So being aware from both sides, if you're the vendor, then make sure and ask about what's going to be required, especially if there's any kind of API or other connectivity to your portal. It's going to be really important. And then if you're the person who's engaging the vendor, making sure to note at least, hey, we need to get your people talking to our people here quick because we've got some information security requirements as part of the engagement. And that doing that earlier in the process, I think would be quite helpful. Great. So kind of moving on to cyber insurance, and obviously, Rachel, this is you spent more than 15 years of your professional career on this topic. Can you kind of walk through what the types of insurance programs are and how they're used?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if you had asked me, who's buying cyber insurance 5-10 years ago, there were three main industries, and they all had to do more on the privacy side, right? There were companies like retailers, healthcare organizations, and financial institutions. Those were the top three buying the coverage. You had a number of technology companies who were data aggregators, but at the end of the day, those were the top three. And those were also the top three that were suffering the cyber attacks, right? But now with ransomware really being industry agnostic, cyber insurance has evolved. The coverage itself has really broadened, and I'm going to pat myself on the back as a cyber broker, because that's really our job, right? Is to go out there and advocate for a really broad policy that you could drive a truck through and pick up all the indemnification that we want for our clients when they have a cyber attack. But the basic coverages are, you have first party and you have third party coverages. And anybody that knows anything about insurance means third party is basically when people make a demand on you for damages, right? Whether it's a regulator, a company, a client, it's someone who's saying, you caused me harm, you owe me money. So that's the third party asking you for money. That's the liability component. The first party, though, is what's super unique to cyber. It has some cousins over on the property side, but those are basically covering all of the costs that you incur in responding to the event, the attack. All the vendors that you hire, you have to pay them money for the services that they're performing for you and helping you get back up and running, whether it's Deb and her privacy outside counsel expertise and her breach response expertise, or the forensic investigator or the public relations firm, so on and so forth. So those are the two basic pieces. I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole, but you should be working closely with your broker to say, I want those coverages as broad as possible. Typically, though, right now, going back to that cybersecurity slide I showed earlier with the 12 different cybersecurity controls, what's happened is in this very challenging threat environment, the insurance companies have narrowed the scope of coverage for companies that do not have the controls they need to have in place. So some of these requests, even like going back to clients who don't even have an incident response plan, some of the insurance companies have said, okay, because you're not doing your part from a risk management perspective, I'm going to narrow how much insurance I give you, or so I'm going to charge you a lot more.
We've had a couple of interesting questions from participants. Sarah asks, as part of the insurance process, is there any kind of operational technology or critical infrastructure minimums that are established by the carriers or due diligence that they're engaging from their perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the cybersecurity controls that we talked about on the former page, that's absolutely, all of those are throughout your environment, whether they be a process or an actual security control that should be implemented. Those are all minimums. From an operational technology, so like if I'm a manufacturer of widgets, right, I make stuff, there's a whole set of series of questions around operational technology, and now you're protecting that separate and apart from your corporate systems, right? Because if the corporate systems get hacked, can I at least say I have the operational piece broken off? Because the operational piece is, after all, how you're making the money, right? You sell that stuff to make money. So, okay, great, I can't pay my invoices, but I can at least make the stuff and keep selling it. So that's a big question that underwriters are focused on right now.
And for those who haven't toured a manufacturing plant, it would absolutely blow your mind, the level of technology and measuring devices, especially in the food production world where you're pasteurizing and doing other things. It's really an essential part. Rosa asks also an interesting, sorry.
I just, one more thing I want to add on that, because of the how, in some cases, how old the technology is. There's something called end-of-life systems that are no longer supported by the original company that made that technology or that software or that application. This is a heavy, heavy area of focus that the underwriters are talking about, because their concern is the technology is so outdated that there is no effective security or control on top of it to prevent ransomware attack. So the underwriters are scrutinizing this, and they're asking companies, what are you doing to have as a compensating control to protect that environment that is so old? So just something to be mindful of.
And also enable operations in a breach or a ransom attack.
Right.
Rosa asks, what's the typical amount of coverage and how do you calibrate that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $54,000 question, is everybody wants to know how much insurance I want to buy. So here's how we approach it. The first question you have to ask yourself is, how much could I lose if I get attacked, right? And so that really does vary from company to company. So will I lose revenue? Meaning it's perishable. Like if I don't sell it today, it's gone, right? So if I can't do the business I'm in, that's truly lost revenue, as opposed to just delayed, I'll make it up next week. But the extra expense component to it, right? All of the expenses you incur, you have to sort of think about that. And, you know, that's something that somebody like a Deb and me could help you with, sort of dissecting that in terms of your incident response plan. What are all the costs you're going to incur? And that's something that the insurance policy can cover. We have models. There's a number of companies out there that can help you from a quantification standpoint. We pride ourselves on our ability to help take some very important demographic factors from your business, industry, revenue, et cetera, and we help you assess and sort of predict out what does a loss look like for your company. So it varies.
All right. Well, as we look to conclude the program in the last couple minutes, a kind of a handful of questions here. First, we had summarized the top 5 things that the participants can do today to help improve their company in this critical area. And Rachel, can you talk about the first topic? This kind of comes from your earlier information about, you know, who's asking you what questions and the importance of having it involved at all levels.
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of questions that companies are asking in terms of, you know, boards are trying to just get their arms around the security landscape. What should we be doing? And they're relying on their chief information security officers and chief information officers and technology officers to tell them, look, board of directors, this is what we need from you as the professionals protecting the firm. We need X amount of dollars so that we can implement all these controls, right, that we need to protect the company. And the boards of directors are also leaning in and saying, maybe we need to have a board member who's a technologist, right? So you start to see that more and more as boards are even asking the question, do we have the right composition of board members, right? So there's a fair amount of conversation going on about that. I have to answer a question that's in the chat right here. I'm sorry, there's someone who asked a question around the types of cyber coverage, and the only reason I have to answer it is they said, you know, is this something that general liability policies can cover? I want to be very clear. In the age of cyber threats, most other general insurance policies, whether it be general liability, directors and officers liability, crime, property, they have all said, we are not covering these losses. These direct losses that are coming out of these events, they may cover, for example, a board of directors lawsuit saying the board didn't do their due diligence that we're talking about here, but they are not going to cover the direct costs coming out of these cyber events. So I had to answer that question.
Absolutely.
Because it was a very important one.
Yeah, those general policies understand this is a unique type of risk that's not going to be covered under your general policy, including both the direct the direct costs of payment of ransom, access to the resources and such like that. Deb, can you talk about the importance of training and testing and preventing phishing and social engineering?
Yes, so many breaches are caused by human error. Somebody clicks on a phishing email, somebody is on vacation and uses public Wi-Fi that's unsecured and et cetera. So I think training staff is incredibly important. There's a number of companies out there that provide security training. We do it for our clients on a custom basis sometimes too. But just, train people how to spot a phishing email. There's also programs out there that will phish your employees. They'll tailor the phish to look like it's coming from your HR department or whatever. And then you see who clicks on it or give a reward to people who didn't click on it, that kind of thing. And yeah, social engineering is very sophisticated. They look on LinkedIn and try to get details of people in the company. And so, just really important to be mindful of all of that.
Rachel, you've already kind of addressed this in answering the prior question, but ensuring that you have the coverages that are appropriate to business. Can you talk briefly on that?
Sure, yeah. And so there's different ways you can buy cyber insurance. Sometimes it's on a standalone basis. For some smaller businesses, they are still able to purchase that coverage within what we call a package policy, a business owner's protective. And then some specialty businesses, particularly in the technology sector, may purchase cyber insurance with what they call professional liability or technology errors and omissions coverage. So it's available out there to cover all of these costs that we've talked about and these liabilities. And there's a very viable market out there. It has been a challenging market in which I've operated in the last 18 months. But the competition is coming back, and we can work very closely with our clients in putting together underwriting submissions.
Terrific. And then the final two are kind of related to each other. And Deb, you identified the importance of some basic things like having your vendor lists available, having them in paper form, personal cell phone numbers and call lists and such like that. One question that Brian asked earlier in the presentation is whether if you deal with a regular security firm and in your ordinary course of business, is it a conflict of interest to kind of go back to them if you have a breach, or is it better to use the existing technology security firms that you've been working with?
So I wouldn't say it's a conflict of interest, but they could have been the cause of the breach is something to keep in mind. I have some, smaller clients who use sort of, an outsourced IT guy who's like one person and that person failed to implement the patches, and that's the result of why the breach was caused in the first place, right? They may try to sort of protect themselves and not disclose everything, so sometimes it's helpful to have an independent third party look at the full picture. Also, data forensics is a very specific specialty area, and so whoever you're using for your general security, cybersecurity, physical security, whatever, may not have that expertise. In addition, many of my clients will also sometimes find it beneficial to engage a company that can do darknet searching to find out, if certain data that they're not sure if it's been exfiltrated, but they think it may have been, then a company can go into the darknet and search and say, hey, yeah, it's for sale on these forums, right? Just to clarify that, or no, it's not available anywhere, and so maybe nobody actually took it.
All right, well, terrific. Well, thank you again for an amazing set of information for the participants. If you have additional questions or would like to get advice on the topic, I highly recommend Rachel and Deb to you. Here's their contact information again. Thanks to both of you for helping us learn a lot more in this super important, evolving topic, and to help companies in our industry stay prepared and protect themselves.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.